I've recently fallen in love with the super sweet cottagecore stylings of Sylvanian Families. These tiny flocked critters have a fabulous sense of style, and as much as I enjoy staring at their teeny tiny dresses, I'd much rather prance around in my very own gen-sized version. Before I can begin sewing the dress, I need to know what it looks like. I sketched out this little illustration outlining the features and changes I wanted to make to the dress. Normally, my get it done yesterday brain convinces me that this step is a waste of time, but throughout this project, I found it really reassuring having a picture in front of me that wasn't just a vague sense of dressmaking in my mind's eye. Now, I'm not promising that this is a well-constructed dress tutorial, but let's say, hypothetically, you wanted to create this yourself. Apart from a sewing machine, and perhaps an overlocker if you have one, you will need a number of things. 3 to 4 meters of your chosen fabric. In this case, I chose a green linen. At least 9 meters of gathered lace. Your pattern. A variety of rulers. 12 buttons. Wide yellow ribbon. Narrow yellow ribbon. A brooch back. Some cotton thread that matches the ribbon and dress material. A regular machine foot, a button foot, scissors, seam rippers, some sort of pen-like utensil to mark your fabric, and finally, pins and needles. But Jen, I don't have a pattern, I hear you gasp on the wind. A little secret about YouTube is there are many tutorials that can teach you how to make a dress pattern way better than I ever could. But on your screen, you shall observe a handy dandy guide to the pieces that you probably need for this project. I will have a download link in the description. Before cutting, I usually like to trace each pattern piece onto my fabric using a pen of some description. In this case, I'm using a pen that has erasable ink, so once I'm finished, I can just erase my marks. I do this without the seam allowance included because I find it easier to follow, but there are many seamstresses who prefer to include the seam allowance in their tracings. Once I'm done tracing the pattern onto the fabric, I cut out the pieces, including about 1 centimeter for seam allowance. Once all of your pieces are cut, it'll look a little like this. In any creative project, not just sewing, there are usually a set of tedious tasks that will bring a level of polish to the final product that's otherwise impossible to achieve. The caveat is, if you don't do these steps, you can normally finish the project and most people will be none the wiser. I call these tasks the unfun bits. As unfun as these tasks are, I always like to start my sewing sessions with them. In this case, it's making the pockets and creating the facings for the neck and the buttons. If I leave them to the end, I will get lazy and I will leave them out. But if I do them at the start of my project when I'm fresh and invigorated, it's not that much of an effort to include them in the final product. A small side note, I got really lazy with pressing my seams in this project. If you're gonna actually do this, which you're probably not, but if you do, make sure to press your seams between every step. Trust me, it's way easier. If sleeves weren't so necessary in the creation of this dress, I would also class these as an unfun bit. There's just something about sewing sleeves, especially when they're poofy, that's quite tedious. I like to start my sleeves by overlocking the straight edge, then sewing the whole sleeve into a loop, right sides together. The next step is to attach the lace in a hem-friendly way, as per the graphic you can see on your screen right now. Once the lace was attached, I sewed a band of elastic the circumference of my arm around the edge, hemmed the sleeves and put them to one side. I like to start bodice construction by pinning the front to the back, right sides together. Then I sew the side seams and the shoulder seams and overlock them to finish. Once this step is completed, it's time to sew the sleeves onto the bodice. For the most accurate sleeve placement, I like to start at the pit seams of the bodice and sleeves, pinning right sides together. Then I pin all the way up the arm right until I've hit 5 centimeters away from the shoulder. Once I hit that point, it's time to gather the poof. There are countless ways to gather fabric, the easiest of which is to purchase a gathering foot for your machine. I am a natural procrastinator and have not purchased a gathering foot, despite talking about buying one for quite literally the last maybe 5 years or so. As a poor footless soul, my preferred method of gathering is the pin method. This is done by continually dividing the excess fabric in half using pins until the desired gathering texture is reached. The final part of bodice construction, sewing lace along the bottom edge of the bodice in a hem-friendly way. If you're like me and you don't own a gathering foot and also have a preference for pin gathers, to attach the skirt to the bodice, you're going to want a lot of pins. How many pins, you might ask? I own a lot of pins and I ran out halfway through pinning the skirt part to the bodice. On this dress, I pin gathered 4 meters of fabric down to 1 meter of space. Once I completed the monumental task of pin gathering my gathers, I stitched the bodice to the skirt panel, removed the pins, and ran a top stitch along the bottom side of the bodice to ensure the seam and lace would sit correctly. Little context for those of you who have never made one of these sewing videos before. At this point, the facing point, I had been filming and sewing for approximately 8 hours, and I was a little bit out of patience. Someday, I shall show you how to do a facing on a dress. That day is not today. I have included in the description a link to a video that will, again, teach you how to face a garment way better than I ever could. Once the facing and hem was done, it was time to stitch in the buttons and buttonholes. I started with the buttonholes, 12 in total, spaced 7 centimeters apart. On my machine, I have an automatic button foot, so once I set the length of the buttonhole, it will just stitch identical buttonholes infinitely until you switch it off. Your machine may be different. Once the buttonholes were in, I opened them up with my seam ripper, then sewed the buttons in the corresponding spots on the opposite side. The final step to finishing the dress was to sew on the pockets. Up until recently, my I'm a feminist butt was, when I sew my clothes, I can't be bothered to put on pockets. I opted for a simple visible pocket, double top stitched to the outside in a comfy position. It looks a little like this. The dress is done. But the outfit's not done. Still needs one final piece, the yellow bow. Because I eventually want to style this dress in a variety of ways, I opted to make my bow detachable. You can buy this bow on my website for $15 redos if you want to help me make more videos like this. The first step is to test out the amount of ribbon I think I might need. Make a little adjustment and then finalize it with a little snip. Then folding the ribbon into an aesthetically pleasing bow shape. I secured this in place with my matching thread and a couple of hand stitches. Next, I attach the dangly bow bits. I measure out a length of thread that again I find to be aesthetically pleasing, find the approximate middle and secure it to the main bow bit. To hide the stitching, I take approximately 3 centimeters of the narrow thread, seal the edges with a flame to stop the fray, and stitch into the appropriate spot. Finally, I stitch on the brooch back. To finish the bow, I trim the dangly bits, seal them with a flame, and now there's a cute bow brooch that you can stick on multiple garments. Now the dress is sewn and the bow is broached, I think it's time we have ourselves a picnic. Let's go!